Welcome to First Congregational Church in Guilford, Connecticut. As we in the United Church of Christ are fond of saying, whoever you are and wherever you are on your journey, you are welcome here. This morning, we have a guest preacher, one who graciously came to us as an interim during a summer several years ago, the retired Reverend Doug Clark. We are so thankful that he is here today. He has continued his ministry in many ways, one of them focusing on creation care. He has asked that we read a scripture today from Psalm 8, and allow your mind to think about God and our creation and how we care for all within as we hear these words. As we go to the text, roll your shoulders back, open hands and hearts and minds. Let us take a deep breath in, breathe out, and listen now to the beauty found in our text. O Lord, our sovereign, Creator God, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. From the lips of infants and children you bring forth words of power and praise to answer your adversaries and to silence the hostile and the vengeful. When I look at the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of us, mortals that you care for us? Yet you have made us a little lower than yourself and crowned us with glory and honor. You have given us dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things underfoot, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea. O Lord, our sovereign, Holy One, how majestic is your name in all the earth. May God grant us wisdom and understanding to this passage.
Thank you so much, Reverend Ginger, for that welcome. I'm honored to be able to fill the pulpit this morning at the First Congregational Church in Guilford, as the expression goes. And I have very fond memories of the few months that I spent as your Bridge Interim Associate Minister a few summers ago. And I'm recalling those were the good old days. Those were the pre-pandemic days. I am grateful that I have been retired during this whole time of pandemic. And I have so much respect for my colleagues in ministry who have had to adapt and do things differently and really manage all the stress that's been a part of this. And I certainly admire those of you who are members of this congregation as well for your faithfulness and your steadfastness during this time of global viral pandemic. I invite you to pray with me. Holy God, breathe your Spirit into us and among us. May the words that I speak and the responses your people offer be acceptable in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I am generally not a great fan of what's often called bumper sticker theology, such as honk if you love Jesus. On the other hand, sometimes I think a bumper sticker can convey some significant wisdom in a few words. The one I'm thinking of lately is this one: if you're not outraged, you haven't been paying attention. Now, if there were a 2022 version of this bumper sticker, it might read like this: if you're not, parentheses, overwhelmed, anxious, outraged, fearful, distressed, fatigued, depressed, resigned, close parentheses, you haven't been paying attention. Now, I realize that that's too long to fit on a bumper sticker. It would not be a particularly catchy one. But it's almost impossible these days, with everything that's going on, not to pay attention. And it can be pretty stressful to pay attention as well. We all know that we're living now in what Deborah Rienstra, who teaches at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, what Deborah Rienstra calls a time of crisis convergence. And here are the crises that are converging in May of 2022. Obviously, the ongoing global viral pandemic, which is the latest variant is spreading rapidly here in Connecticut. Russia's brutal assault on Ukraine, the Republican Party's assault on voting rights in the United States, the Supreme Court's upcoming assault on women's reproductive freedom, men with assault rifles wreaking havoc on communities of color, and last but not least, lurking in the background, sometimes leaping in the foreground, the overarching crisis of the global climate emergency. So is it any wonder that any of these converging crises seems overwhelming, if not impossible to manage? Is it any surprise that we long for a return to normal as the viral pandemic becomes endemic, or perhaps it still is a pandemic? Is it any mystery that we would rather not pay attention to any of these crises? But a crisis, as the proverb has it, can also be an opportunity. I can't find an opportunity in all of these crises, but in the climate crisis in particular, which I am convinced is both the defining existential and the defining spiritual crisis of the human species, it's also a spiritual opportunity. And that's what I'd like to reflect with you about this morning. Well, it's been a few months since I watched the popular Netflix film, Don't Look Up. And that film, as we know, rippled the waters of the climate crisis complacency, at least for a time. In the film, two obscure scientists, played by Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence, discover a previously unknown comet that is on a direct collision course with Earth. And when they try to warn the world about this imminent catastrophe, no one takes them seriously. Not the media, not industry, not government. In fact, the cynical president, who was marvelously played by Meryl Streep, leads all her followers in a chant of "Don't look up." Just in case you haven't seen the film and you still plan to, I won't tell you how it ends. But it's clear that Don't Look Up is a satire or an allegory about climate change denial. The approaching comet represents climate change, and the cynical president's "Don't Look Up" chant represents climate change denial. And from what I've read and heard about the film Don't Look Up, it's actually gotten a lot of viewers to sit up, look up, and take notice about the climate crisis, which is a good thing. On the other hand, a comet from space is not a particularly accurate metaphor for human-caused global warming. The climate crisis is not a threat from outer space. It's an earthbound, human-caused crisis. So what I want to do this morning is take some of my cues from the film Don't Look Up. And I want to explore with you three spiritual opportunities that the climate crisis offers us. I want to offer three simple spiritual things that we can do in this time of human-caused global warming emergency. And it's summarized in three phrases: look up, look around, and look within. These simple ways of looking can help us reimagine, re-envision, re-admire the beauty of the earth, our home planet. And I think that through these spiritual practices, if you will, of looking up, looking around, and looking within, we can renew our resilience as we work and pray for the good of this beautiful, amazing planet, one of a kind, our only home planet. Look up. That's what the author of Psalm 8 did, probably not once, but many times. And when this psalmist looked up into the sky on a clear night, he saw an incredible dome speckled with a riotous multitude of stars. I would imagine that most of us took the opportunity to look up last Sunday night at the time of the lunar eclipse, and at least when the clouds dispersed, and it was so wondrous to watch that shadow of Earth creeping across the full moon. Most of us, most of the time when you and I look up into the sky on a clear night, our vision is pretty seriously compromised by artificial light pollution. So we can only see a small portion of what the ancient psalmist saw when he looked up at the night sky. But with wonder and mystery, when we look up at the night sky, we can still ask ourselves, as the psalmist asked of himself and God, who are we mortals that you are mindful of us? Today's psalmist, who might be also an astrophysicist or a climate justice activist or a hymn lyricist, might well look up into the sky on a clear night with images from the Hubble Space Telescope in her awareness and ask, who are we mortals and why are we here? Not only on our home planet, this pale blue dot, but also in this far insignificant corner of an unimaginably old and vast universe. As we know, the ancient psalmist answered his question with what I would take to be an exalted view of us mortals. God has given us dominion over the works of God's hands on our home planet, over every living thing that walks on the land or flies in the air or swims in the seas. The first chapter of Genesis articulates a similar view of human identity and vocation. Created a little lower than God, made in God's own image and likeness, we are told to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and every living thing that moves upon the earth. It's important for us to remember when we hear the words of this psalm that biblical scholars, both Jewish and Christian, have shown that the word dominion in Psalm 8 and Genesis 1 does not mean domination or exploitation. Rather, it can be understood to mean responsible management. We humans are called by God to be responsible managers of God's creation. Now, today's psalmist, looking up at the night sky with the images from the Hubble Space Telescope in her awareness, might answer her question with a profound sense of wonder and humility and amazement. For she knows that the images from this Hubble Space Telescope come from long, long ago and far, far away. She knows that planet Earth and all things on our home planet owe their existence to the explosion of stardust, not long after the beginning of the universe, billions of years ago. Today's psalmist might answer her question by saying, we cannot own the sunlit sky. What do you and I see when we look up? We saw perhaps the lunar eclipse the other night. We can see our favorite constellations. About the only one that I recognize, because I've never really learned about the constellation, is the Big Dipper and how it points to Polaris, the North Star. And when the moon shines with reflected sunlight, I just love to watch the phases of the moon, how it changes every night. Sometimes you'd be surprised to see a meteor streak across the sky, or to witness a lunar eclipse, or to be thrilled by the northern lights. There is beautiful beauty and mystery in the night sky. And what do we see when we look up on a cloudless day? We see the deep blue sky. My Canadian mother loved to call this color Canadian blue. On other days, you can be fascinated by the ever-changing patterns of clouds, or watch a hawk gliding effortlessly on invisible breezes, or feel on your face the rain and the snow that water the earth, or admire that rainbow that appears in the late afternoon sky. There is beauty and wonder when we look up in the daytime sky. And what do we see when we look around? We see beauty everywhere. The bluebird or the cardinal outside the window, tiny wildflowers on the forest floor, trout lilies, wood anemones, Canada mayflowers, double-crested cormorants swimming and fishing on the pond, a regal great blue heron overseeing its realm from the edge of the pond, bumblebees and hummingbirds feasting on azalea blossoms, the full beauty of the earth, we humans tilling the earth and protecting it as we are mandated in Genesis 2, verse 15. So with these spiritual practices of looking up and looking around, we can fall in love again with Earth, our home planet. Or we can look at photographs or paintings and we can see the amazing orderliness of the solar system. We can see what Earth looks like from the International Space Station. We can imagine that thin layer of atmosphere enclosing our home planet. It's about as thick as a layer of plastic wrap around a school classroom globe. And so to God we raise our hymns of grateful praise. And as your student intern, Clara Sims, said so well here last month, Praise is the posture of all who remember that life is God-given. Praise is the posture of all who remember that all life, is God-blessed. Today's climate justice advocate, when she looks around, recognizes that we humans have created our own geologic epoch on our home planet. The Anthropocene, in less than a century, hardly a blink of an eye in geologic time, we have set in motion an unprecedented process of human-caused global warming, which has now, as I said, become the defining existential and spiritual crisis of our species. Today's climate justice is also aware of the disproportionate impact of global warming on poor and marginalized communities. I read recently that 7 out of 10 African Americans in our country live in counties that frequently or consistently violate the standards of the Clean Air Act. Climate scientists, justice advocates, and religious leaders overwhelmingly agree that this decade, 2020 to 2030, is indeed a time of climate crisis. Some are even saying climate emergency. Business as usual during this crucial decade will only set the stage for further irreversible damages in climate and weather. In the words of longtime environmental activist Bill McKibben, in a world on fire, we need to stop burning things. We need to stop burning fossil fuels. We need to make a rapid transition to generating our energy not by burning fossil fuels, but by using the wonderful gifts of solar and wind energy. Now, I would imagine that for you, as well as for me, dealing with this climate emergency can be an emotional roller coaster. So when I look within myself and become aware of what's going on inside me, I try to remain calm about the present, and I try to remain hopeful about the future. But I certainly have those days when I have serious doubts about our human capacity to respond adequately to the climate emergency. It's frightening, it's overwhelming, and the obstacles standing in the way of needed changes are daunting. And so there are days when I cycle through a wide range of emotions, anxiety and grief and lament and frustration among them. I'm also coming to realize that there's a growing awareness in this time of converging crises of the value of looking within and not denying the emotions that arise in us when we think about the converging crises in the time in which we're living. Because there's growing awareness that the need to acknowledge that anxiety and grief and lament and frustration are understandable and appropriate and strong and sometimes uncomfortable emotions. That's a very important thing for us to be doing. Because these strong emotions are also essential elements of an emerging ecological spirituality. In the wise words of an editorial in the respected medical journal The Lancet in 2020, these strong emotions may, quote, be the crucible through which humanity must pass to harness the energy and conviction that are needed for the life-saving changes now required. Hannah Malcolm is a young British woman who is studying to become a priest in the Church of England. She's also working on her PhD, and she's writing her dissertation on theology and climate and ecological grief. And she speaks of the embrace of grief as a spiritual calling. The embrace of grief as a spiritual calling. She reminds Christians that we are followers of a man of sorrows who was acquainted with grief. And she writes that she is increasingly convinced that grief is not only a response to losing something loved or a motivator for behaving in loving ways, but a work of love itself. And so, yes, let's look up. Let's look around, and let's also look within ourselves to the complex tangle of emotions that are generated when we look up and we look around. And let's remember how amazed and grateful we are for the beauty of the earth. And let's not be afraid of those feelings of climate anxiety and distress and grief. For all of these emotions, of wonder and gratitude, of humility and lament, all of these emotions can indeed be the crucible through which we humans must pass to harness the energy and the conviction that are needed for the life-saving changes that are now required. These emotions can be part and parcel of what Hannah Malcolm calls the work of love itself. And when it comes to these spiritual practices of looking up, looking around, and looking within, I can think of no better example than the poet Mary Oliver. And so I end with the wise and lovely words of her poem, Wild Geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. Thanks and praise be to God. Amen.
For the beauty of the earth